June 26, 1943. The Ruhr Valley lay beneath a ceiling of low grey clouds, its factories and rail yards hidden under the haze of smoke that never seemed to clear from this heart of German industry. From the cockpits of Messerschmitt Bf 109G fighters belonging to Jagdgeschwader 26, the world appeared in flashes of light and shadow as the squadron climbed to intercept. The men of the Luftwaffe knew this ritual well. American bombers came with the dawn, dragging their escorts across the sky, and it was the job of German defenders to break them apart before they reached the ironworks and chemical plants below. The pilots' confidence came from experience. They carried cannons that had shredded countless enemy machines, 20mm weapons whose explosive shells turned aluminum skins into fire and fragments. To these veterans, the mathematics of battle had always seemed simple. A few bursts, a clean kill, and the American aircraft would disintegrate. But this morning, their prey looked different. The American fighters riding shotgun for the bombers were not the slender P-38s or the smaller P-39s that some had faced before. Instead, the escorts loomed like blunt, oversized beasts. They were Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, known to the Germans by sight but not yet by reputation. To Luftwaffe eyes, they looked ungainly, swollen around their radial engines, heavy-winged, more like bombers stripped of payload than nimble interceptors. Too big, too slow, some thought as they swung their Messerschmitts into firing position. Confidence turned quickly into action. Cannon shells slammed into the lead Thunderbolts. Pilots of JG-26 watched pieces of aluminum skin and control panels fly away in the slipstream. They expected, as always, to see wings shear off or flames burst from the fuel tanks. Instead, the American fighters kept climbing, holding formation, smoke streaming from their tails but their fuselages intact. Some even responded with steady, deliberate fire from 850 caliber Browning machine guns, whose thunder filled the air with a storm of lead. The returning fire was devastating, spraying German fighters with streams of armor-piercing rounds that tore into engines and cockpits. One German recalled the shock. The Messerschmitt had been closing fast, convinced the Thunderbolt was already crippled, only to see its canopy flash with muzzle bursts and feel his own aircraft shudder as the American guns found their mark. He pulled away in disbelief, still expecting the wounded machine to fall, but it did not. Another pilot described the frustration of making repeated firing passes, each time certain that this attack would be the one to break the enemy apart, only to watch the bulky fighter continue to hold together, its pilot still fighting back with grim determination. Technical reports later confirmed what German airmen experienced firsthand. The P-47's airframe was rugged, built with heavier construction than the Luftwaffe expected. Its massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine not only gave it nearly 2,000 horsepower, but also absorbed punishment that would have destroyed liquid-cooled engines like those in the Messerschmitt. Where a single well-placed cannon round might have ignited a Daimler-Benz engine, the Thunderbolt's radial could lose cylinders and still keep turning. Its self-sealing fuel tanks, reinforced armor plates around the cockpit, and sheer bulk meant that it could endure extraordinary damage before succumbing. The disbelief of that June morning spread quickly through the German ranks. What was once seen as a clumsy machine soon revealed itself as a resilient guardian of the bombers. The Thunderbolt might not have turned as sharply as the Messerschmitt at low altitudes, but in the middle and high reaches of the sky, where bombers flew, it proved stubborn, fast in a dive and unnervingly hard to kill. The Luftwaffe veterans who landed their fighters that day returned with a realization none of them wished to admit. Their trusted 20mm cannons were no longer a guarantee of victory. From that encounter above the Ruhr Valley, the legend of the P-47's toughness was born. It was a revelation carved into the memories of those who fought it, a turning point when the Luftwaffe began to sense that the balance of the air war was shifting. To understand why this formidable aircraft existed at all, and how the United States came to field such a machine in the skies over Europe, we must step back into the story of its creation, into the factories, design offices, and strategic debates that forged the Thunderbolt long before it stunned German pilots above the Ruhr. September 1940. While much of Europe lay beneath the shadow of German blitzkrieg, the United States still clung to neutrality, its people hoping the oceans would shield them from war. Yet inside Washington, military planners understood the illusion could not last. The Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies over France and Britain had shown what modern air power could achieve, and if America was drawn into the conflict, its aging fleet of fighters, P-35s, P-36, and the short-lived P-43 Lancer would be utterly outclassed. At Republic Aviation's plant in Farmingdale, Long Island, the responsibility for changing that reality fell to a Georgian-born engineer named Alexander Kartveli. Kartveli had already seen what fragility in combat aircraft cost. The P-35 had been obsolete the moment it entered service, and the P-43 Lancer, though faster, proved incapable of surviving against modern cannon-armed fighters at high altitude. He was determined that the next design would not make the same mistakes. Kartveli argued, against many in the Army Air Corps establishment, that America's future fighter could not be a nimble lightweight meant to match the turn of a Messerschmitt. It had to be something else entirely, a larger, stronger machine that could climb with heavy bombers, endure fire, and still deliver punishing blows of its own. His philosophy summed up to one principle: better to field an armored beast than a fragile acrobat. That vision took shape in September 1940, when Republic began sketching the outlines of the aircraft that would become the XP-47B. At its heart would sit a power plant unlike anything yet seen in a U.S. fighter, the Pratt Whitney R-2800. Double Wasp, a twin-row 18-cylinder radial engine. It generated more than 2,000 horsepower, a staggering figure in an era when most American fighters struggled to pass 1,000. Kartveli paired this engine with plans for 8 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, giving the new aircraft the heaviest armament of any U.S. fighter to date. It would not just survive combat, it would dominate it with firepower. In April 1941, after months of hurried construction and relentless testing, the XP-47B prototype rolled onto the runway at Farmingdale for its first flight. Test pilots climbed into the unusually tall cockpit, its canopy perched high above the wings, and opened the throttle. The Double Wasp roared to life with a sound that shook the airfield, and as the machine lifted into the sky, observers immediately sensed something different. The aircraft accelerated with remarkable stability, climbed with a vigor that earlier U.S. designs had lacked, and remained steady at speeds that made other fighters begin to flutter or shake. For Kartveli and the Republic team, it was proof that their gamble, building big, building strong, had paid off. Across the Atlantic, however, German intelligence paid little attention. Reports reaching the Reich suggested that American aviation lagged years behind Europe, tied up in producing mediocrities for export contracts rather than true combat machines. Luftwaffe officers believed U.S. factories would continue churning out the kind of underpowered aircraft that had already proven inadequate in China and early in the Pacific. Few in Berlin imagined that American engineers had already embraced a new philosophy, one that rejected delicacy in favor of brute strength and survivability. Yet within the United States, the shape of the future was clear. By the time Europe learned the name Thunderbolt, the machine would already be in production. Its bulk and firepower designed not only to fight, but to endure. And it was this foundation, conceived in 1940 and tested in 1941, that would define the P-47's legend, setting the stage for the technical specifications that made it both feared and respected on battlefields across the world. ChatGPT said, by 1942, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stood apart from every other single-engine fighter in the world. It was, by every measurable statistic, a giant. Fully loaded, the aircraft weighed close to 8 tons, nearly twice the weight of a Messerschmitt Bf-109G, and heavier even than many twin-engine light bombers of the time. Its sheer size was matched only by the heart that powered it. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing more than 2,000 horsepower. To harness this energy, engineers fitted a 4-bladed propeller that stretched over 12 feet in diameter, so large that designers were forced to lengthen the landing gear, simply to keep the blades from striking the ground. The P-47's most radical advantage, however, lay in its turbo supercharging system. A network of ducting and an advanced exhaust-driven turbine allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain full engine power at high altitude, where most fighters began to gasp for air. The result was extraordinary. The Thunderbolt could reach 433 miles per hour at 30,000 feet and had a service ceiling beyond 40,000 feet. In an era when most Luftwaffe interceptors struggled above 36,000, the P-47 could outclimb, outdive, and often outlast its opponents in the thin air where bombers flew. Its armament was equally uncompromising. 850 caliber Browning M. 2 machine guns were mounted in the wings, 4 per side, delivering a combined rate of fire that unleashed nearly 100 rounds per second. Each gun carried 425 rounds, giving a P-47 pilot more than 3 minutes of sustained fire, a luxury few German fighters could afford with their smaller ammunition loads. This firepower was enough to shred enemy aircraft, tear through armored locomotives, or rake columns of vehicles on the ground. As if that were not enough, the Thunderbolt could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or unguided rockets, transforming it into a formidable fighter bomber. In one machine, the U.S. Army Air Forces possessed both an escort fighter and a strike aircraft. Yet numbers alone do not explain why the Thunderbolt became legend. Its true reputation came from survivability. Unlike the liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz and BMW engines that powered the Bf-109 and FW-190, the P-47's massive radial engine could take staggering punishment and keep running. Armor plates shielded the pilot, while its cockpit was fronted by thick bullet-resistant glass. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of fire even when pierced by cannon shells. German pilots would later complain that their 20mm rounds seemed to pass straight through without bringing the enemy down. Accounts describe Thunderbolts returning from missions with entire control surfaces shot away, cylinders missing from the engine, and great holes ripped into their fuselages, yet still able to limp back across the channel to land. By 1943, stories of the Thunderbolt's toughness had spread across both Allied and Axis lines. To American bomber crews, it was a guardian angel, a heavy fighter that could dive like a stone upon attacking interceptors and absorb the punishment of return fire. To the Luftwaffe, it was a baffling new adversary, not sleek, not graceful, but unstoppable. In their eyes, it was an armored fortress disguised as a fighter, an aircraft that refused to fall from the sky even under the heaviest blows. These specifications, its size, its power, its firepower, and above all its resilience, were no longer theoretical. They would soon be tested in the crucible of combat, in the bitter skies over occupied Europe, where the Thunderbolt would earn its baptism of fire and carve its place in history. April 1943 marked the moment when the P-47 Thunderbolt first bared its teeth in the skies of Europe. After months of stateside training and preparation, the U.S. 8th Air Force began fielding the aircraft from bases in England, initially assigning them to escort bombers and conduct fighter sweeps across northern France. From the very beginning, limitations were obvious. The Thunderbolt's prodigious size and fuel-thirsty engine gave it impressive power, but a disappointingly short range, barely sufficient to cover bomber formations into occupied France, and nowhere near enough to protect them deep over Germany. Yet though its endurance fell short, its resilience left an indelible mark from the first shots fired. On April 15, 1943, the 4th Fighter Group took the Thunderbolt into combat for the first time on a mission near Rouen. There, they encountered Messerschmitt Bf-109s of the Luftwaffe, veterans who had already fought over Spain, Poland, France, and the Channel. These German pilots, confident in the lethality of their 20mm cannons, made repeated firing passes, each expecting to see the new American machines trail smoke, lose control, and spiral into the earth. Instead, the opposite occurred. Strikes that should have been fatal merely tore panels away or scarred the paint. The bulky Thunderbolts continued flying, some with smoking exhausts, others still climbing toward their enemies, and in return, they unleashed withering firepower from their 850 caliber Brownings. Reports from Jagdgeschwader 2, the Richthofen wing, preserved the disbelief of that day. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots described frustration at emptying bursts of ammunition into the American fighters, only to see them remain aloft and press the attack. One field note recorded the unexpected durability of the new type, remarking that it could receive many hits without breaking apart. For the Germans, trained to expect most Allied fighters to collapse under well-placed cannon fire, It was a jarring experience. For the Americans, it was vindication. The P-47 was proving in combat exactly what Kartveli had promised in design. Through the spring and summer, the Thunderbolt spread to more groups. The 56th Fighter Group, under the leadership of the fiery and tactical Hubert Zemke, began carving out a reputation that would forever tie its name to the aircraft. Zemke drilled his men relentlessly, exploiting the Thunderbolt's strengths, its stability in high-speed dives, its crushing firepower, and above all, its toughness. German pilots who managed to land after fighting Zemke's Wolfpack often remarked that they could not fathom how so many hits had failed to bring down the armored American. By mid-1943, bomber crews flying into the heart of the Reich began to feel the difference. Though Thunderbolts could not yet follow them to every target, their presence on the approaches over France provided reassurance. Gunner diaries noted how the Germans hesitate longer before closing when P-47s were nearby. At the same time, Luftwaffe intelligence began scrambling to analyze this new opponent, piecing together fragments from wrecks and combat reports to understand why the machine endured so much punishment. These first clashes did not win the air war on their own, but they revealed the Thunderbolt's potential. For the Allies, it was a weapon finally able to contest the Luftwaffe on nearly equal terms. For the Germans, it was a troubling new puzzle. An aircraft that seemed too heavy to fly as it did, yet too strong to die when struck. As the summer of 1943 wore on, what began as disbelief hardened into recognition. A new era of aerial combat had arrived, and the Luftwaffe would have to find a way to counter it. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe's first impressions of the Thunderbolt had hardened into formal intelligence reports. What had begun as confusion during those initial clashes over France soon gave way to systematic analysis. Luftwaffe Reich compiled dossiers based on combat encounters, pilot debriefings, and fragments of downed aircraft. Again and again, the same themes emerged. The American fighter was exceptionally large, built with a strength more akin to an attack aircraft than a nimble interceptor, and powered by an engine that seemed impervious to damage. German officers noted its extraordinarily heavy construction, a phrase that appeared in more than one evaluation, and its enormous Pratt Whitney radial engine, which gave it unusual climbing performance and resilience at altitude. One particular concern repeated itself in these reports: the Thunderbolt's ability to dive. German pilots of Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26 admitted that their Bf-109s, though agile in turns, struggled to follow once the P-47 tipped its nose down. Luftwaffe engineering assessments recorded that the American machine could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive without losing structural integrity, a feat nearly impossible for the Messerschmitt, which risked catastrophic failure at such speeds. This meant that when pressed, the American pilots could escape combat by diving away, or worse, they could use that momentum to strike back with devastating passes. Among frontline flyers, technical observations quickly turned into dark rumors. Many believed the Thunderbolt had armor plating across its fuselage, not just around the cockpit, and some likened it to a Sturzkampfflugzeug, a dive bomber disguised as a fighter. Stories spread that it was virtually immune to 20mm cannon fire, and whether or not these claims were exaggerated, the psychological effect was profound. Younger pilots, fresh from training, sometimes entered combat already convinced the bulky American machine was indestructible. When they fired and saw no immediate result, that suspicion hardened into fear. To combat these perceptions, Luftwaffe Command circulated memoranda, instructing pilots to aim carefully for specific vulnerabilities: the cockpit, the fuel lines, or the oil system of the radial engine. Yet in the swirling chaos of high-altitude dogfights, such precision was rarely possible. Bursts that would have downed a Spitfire or a Yak-1 often passed through the P-47's frame with little visible effect. German ground crews later admitted that morale among fighter pilots sagged as the reputation of the Thunderbolt grew. Battles were not only contests of metal and fire, but of belief, and the belief that one's enemy could not be destroyed was corrosive. Eventually, crashed airframes and captured documents gave Berlin a clearer picture. The Thunderbolt was not armored across every surface, nor was it truly invulnerable. Its size and weight imposed limits on maneuverability. and its short range kept it from reaching the deep industrial heartland of the Reich. Yet by the time these clarifications arrived, the myth of its indestructibility had already taken root. That myth alone shaped Luftwaffe tactics, forcing caution where once there had been boldness. On the other side of the Atlantic, American commanders were reading these same German assessments with keen interest. They understood that even exaggerated reports of the Thunderbolt's durability were a weapon in themselves, sowing doubt among German formations. At the same time, they recognized the very real weaknesses the enemy had identified, especially its limited escort radius. The response was not retreat but acceleration. Production lines in Farmingdale, Evansville, and elsewhere were pushed to maximum capacity, with industrial adjustments ensuring that thousands more Thunderbolts would be delivered to Allied airfields. What had begun as a technical marvel was now becoming something more decisive, a weapon of overwhelming numbers, soon to dominate European skies not only by its qualities, but by its sheer presence. By late 1942, the Republic P-47 was no longer just an experimental marvel. It had become a centerpiece of America's wartime industrial might. The United States had committed itself to a scale of production the world had never before witnessed, and the Thunderbolt was one of its crowning achievements. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 15,600 P-47s rolled off assembly lines, making it one of the most produced fighter aircraft of the entire war. These were not simple machines. Each Thunderbolt required more than 65,000 individual parts, drawn from a nationwide network of suppliers: aluminum from Pittsburgh, engines from Pratt Whitney's plants, machine guns from Colt, hydraulic systems, propellers, and miles of wiring. Yet the American system, perfected through a fusion of mass production and skilled labor, ensured that these complex fighters emerged in staggering numbers, often faster than German air defenses could bring them down. The epicenters of this production effort stretched across the country. At Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant on Long Island, assembly lines expanded into cavernous hangars where workers, many of them women entering the industrial workforce for the first time, labored in shifts around the clock. In Evansville, Indiana, a massive new factory was built specifically to turn out P-47s, its opening celebrated as both a regional and national triumph. At peak output, a completed Thunderbolt left these facilities every 30 minutes, a pace that stunned visiting officials. The Luftwaffe, already straining under the weight of the Allied bombing campaign, could not dream of matching such tempo. While German factories struggled to replace lost Bf-109s and Fw-190s, American airfields in England received steady shipments of brand-new Thunderbolts, often arriving faster than units could absorb them. Logistics magnified this advantage. The U.S. Army Air Forces and the British ground crews supporting them maintained supply chains that ensured not only new aircraft, but a constant stream of spare parts. A damaged Thunderbolt that might have been scrapped in another air force could often be repaired and flying again within days. Crated fuselages, engines, and wing sections flowed across the Atlantic, unloaded in Liverpool or Bristol, then trucked to frontline maintenance depots. This meant that Luftwaffe victories, when they came, were fleeting. A pilot might celebrate shooting down one or even two P-47s, only to see fresh squadrons appear the very next day, the losses already replenished. For German airmen, this became a demoralizing reality. The Thunderbolt itself was already hard to kill, but even when brought down, its absence was temporary. As one Luftwaffe veteran later remarked, "For every one we destroyed, two more took its place." Allied commanders understood this cumulative effect. The Thunderbolt was not only a weapon in the air, but also a symbol of the inexhaustible capacity of American industry. Where the Reich was shrinking under the pressure of fuel shortages, factory bombings, and material scarcity, the United States was expanding its reach with greater strength each month. As production surged, the Thunderbolt's battlefield role broadened. At first a high-altitude escort fighter, its rugged airframe and heavy ordnance capacity soon made it ideal for ground attack. By mid-1943 and especially into 1944, Thunderbolts were fitted with bombs, rockets, and long-range drop tanks, transforming them into versatile strike aircraft capable of devastating German railways, armored columns, and troop concentrations. This evolution from defender of bombers to scourge of the battlefield, opened a new chapter in the Thunderbolt's combat record, one that would prove just as decisive as its duels with the Luftwaffe. By the summer of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become a central pillar of Allied air power in Western Europe. What had begun as a high-altitude escort fighter now evolved into a versatile instrument of destruction, perfectly suited for the coming invasion. In the weeks leading up to Operation Overlord, Thunderbolts roared over northern France daily, striking rail yards, fuel depots and bridges to choke off German supply lines. Their deep, growling engines became a familiar sound to both the French, civilians awaiting liberation, and the German troops bracing for attack. On June 6, 1944, the long-awaited day arrived. As the first Allied soldiers stormed ashore on the beaches of Normandy, the P-47 was overhead, flying sortie after sortie in support of the landings. The Thunderbolt's heavy 50-caliber guns swept across German strongpoints, strafing defensive positions, artillery emplacements, and armored vehicles. Infantry units reported with horror that the American fighters returned again and again, diving low over hedgerows to shred convoys and horse-drawn wagons with fire that seemed unending. Trucks erupted in flames, columns scattered, and even when anti-aircraft gunners managed to hit, the broad-shouldered aircraft often clawed back into the sky, trailing smoke yet still alive. For the Luftwaffe units tasked with resisting the invasion, the Thunderbolt was no less formidable. Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2 scrambled to challenge the Allied armada of fighters and bombers, but their interception efforts were frustrated. Time after time, German pilots fired bursts into the P-47's fuselage, only to see it dive on through and continue its mission. Reports filed in the days following D-Day spoke of remarkable resistance to damage, a grudging acknowledgement that this aircraft could not be stopped with the same tactics that had once proven lethal against Spitfires or early American types. It was the ruggedness of the design that made such endurance possible. The P-47's radial engine, armored cockpit, and self-sealing fuel tanks allowed it to descend through curtains of flak, deliver ordnance, and still recover. Pilots recounted, returning to base with wings holed, elevators shredded or entire cylinders blown away, yet still managing to land. To German soldiers on the ground, this created the impression of an indestructible machine, a steel beast that shrugged off both shells and bullets. The ferocity of the Thunderbolt's contribution reached its peak 2 months later in the battles of the Falaise Pocket. As German forces attempted to retreat eastward, they found themselves trapped in narrow corridors of road and field. P-47 squadrons descended relentlessly, bombing and strafing with such intensity that whole columns were annihilated. Burned out. Trucks, shattered tanks and abandoned wagons littered the roads. Survivors described scenes of utter chaos as the American fighters circled above like hawks, diving at will. Here the Thunderbolt's transformation into a true fighter-bomber was complete, and its reputation cemented as a terror both in the air and on the ground. By the end of the Normandy campaign, even hardened German troops regarded the P-47 with grim respect. It was no longer just an escort fighter, but a symbol of Allied dominance, a machine that seemed impossible to stop and impossible to escape. Its legend, already whispered among Luftwaffe pilots in 1943, now spread among infantrymen, tank crews, and artillery units across France. From this moment onward, the Thunderbolt was not merely a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of fear, and it is here that the story turns, to examine how the psychological impact of this aircraft became almost as decisive as its firepower. July 7, 1944, northern France. The summer air was heavy with dust and the acrid tang of burning fuel as German infantry clung to defensive positions outside Saint-Lô. In the haze of late afternoon, the deep, unmistakable growl of radial engines cut through the drone of artillery fire. Soldiers looked skyward and froze. A formation of P-47 Thunderbolts was descending, their wide, heavy frames glinting in the sun. Flak gunners opened fire and 20-minute shells burst around the American fighters. To the men on the ground, the sight was familiar. Sparks and smoke trailed across the wings as cannon shells struck home. But then came the shock. What should have been a kill simply was not. The Thunderbolts kept flying, angling into a dive, and the air filled with the staccato hammering of 850 caliber machine guns tearing through trucks and infantry columns. Survivors later recalled that even as rounds tore through fuselages, the aircraft seemed unstoppable, banking away to climb again and return for another pass. The resilience of the Thunderbolt became a nightmare for Luftwaffe pilots as well. Reports from mid-1944 reveal their mounting frustration. Jagdgeschwader units noted that even direct cannon hits failed to bring the P-47 down quickly. Interceptor crews, already weary from relentless Allied bombing raids, began to doubt their own firepower. A Luftwaffe pilot later admitted that it felt as if they were fighting an aircraft built beyond destruction. The psychological weight of facing such a foe was immense. Each mission against American bombers meant not only battling the flying, fortresses and liberators, but also surviving the inevitable arrival of Thunderbolts that seemed impervious to ordinary damage. For the Americans, the effect was the opposite. Bomber crews who had once counted losses in the dozens during daylight raids now felt a shield forming around them. Morale reports from the U.S. 8th Air Force in 1944 describe a growing sense of confidence as P-47s joined their escorts. Airmen who once feared the long flight to Germany now trusted that the Jug would stand between them and the Luftwaffe. The shift was dramatic, a reversal of the despair of 1943, when missions to places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg had nearly broken the daylight bombing campaign. On the ground, German troops coined their own bitter shorthand. To them, the aircraft was simply the Jug, short for Juggernaut. Its reputation was not merely for air-to-air duels, but for the devastating low-level strafing and bombing runs that shredded supply columns, artillery parks, and retreating convoys. Survivor accounts describe how men dived for cover at the first distant rumble of its radial engine, convinced that no cover was safe. The sound alone became a trigger for panic, a warning that destruction was seconds away. Allied propaganda eagerly amplified this legend. Newspapers and newsreels carried stories of Thunderbolts limping back to English airfields, wings and fuselage torn open by fire, engines smoking, yet somehow landing intact. Tales of these indestructible Jugs spread quickly, reinforcing the myth of an aircraft that simply refused to die. Whether exaggerated or not, such accounts magnified the aura of invincibility, serving as a powerful psychological weapon in their own right. By late summer 1944, the P-47 had become more than a machine. It was a symbol, a flying fortress of morale for one side, and a harbinger of despair for the other. German interceptor units entered combat already convinced of their disadvantage, while American pilots climbed into their cockpits with growing faith in their aircraft's ability to bring them home. This psychological divide proved as decisive as any technological edge. The Luftwaffe's fighting spirit, once the terror of Europe, was being steadily eroded by a machine that seemed unbreakable. With morale shattered and confidence waning, German command now faced not only the physical destruction of its forces, but the collapse of its will to contest the skies. From this point forward, the war in the air was no longer a contest of equals. The balance had tipped decisively, and the Thunderbolt's psychological dominance would help clear the way for the final strategic campaigns against the Reich. By late 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become a fixture in the skies over Western Europe, reshaping not just the air war but the entire tactical balance of the battlefield below. Its range, once a crippling limitation, had been extended through the use of external drop tanks, allowing Thunderbolt squadrons to push deeper into German territory than ever before. Though the sleek, long-legged P-51 Mustang would ultimately take over the primary burden of long-range escort, the Jug had found a role uniquely its own. It became the scourge of the battlefield, a flying arsenal that terrorized rail lines, convoys, and armored spearheads alike. The impact was immediate and devastating. German supply trains that once rolled confidently across the Reich were forced to operate only under cover of night, their daylight journeys reduced to little more than suicide runs. Convoys scattered into smaller formations, creeping down side roads and forest tracks in hopes of avoiding detection. Yet Thunderbolts still found them, ripping them apart with bombs, rockets, and the fury of 8 heavy machine guns. Armor columns advancing toward the front discovered that speed alone could not protect them. The Jug's ability to dive at high velocity and endure the hail of flak fire meant that no target was safe. Strategically, the presence of the Thunderbolt imposed a burden far heavier than the bombs it carried. It forced the Luftwaffe to spread itself thin, conserving aircraft and fuel that were already in short supply. Interceptor groups that once sought to dominate the air now struggled simply to survive. Reports from German field commands lamented the impossibility of massing forces without drawing down destruction from above. The American fighter had become not merely a weapon, but a constant, suffocating pressure on every element of Germany's war machine. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble in December 1944, revealed this new reality with brutal clarity. For the first crucial days, poor weather grounded Allied aircraft, granting German armored spearheads a brief window of opportunity. But when the skies cleared, the Thunderbolts returned with a vengeance. P-47 squadrons swooped over snowbound forests and frozen villages, cutting supply lines to ribbons, torching fuel depots, and leaving entire columns of trucks and tanks stranded in flames along the narrow roads. Survivors recalled the deafening roar of strafing runs and the hopeless scramble for cover. Knowing that even the thick Ardennes woods could not shield them from the Jug's wrath, Allied commanders quickly recognized the decisive edge this provided. The Thunderbolt was no longer seen simply as a defender of bombers. It had become a battlefield equalizer, capable of breaking apart German offensives before they could fully take shape. Its armor and firepower made it the ideal weapon to strangle the logistical arteries that sustained the Wehrmacht, ensuring that even the boldest counterattacks would bleed out before reaching their objectives. Yet this dominance came at a cost. For the men who flew it, the P-47 was a machine of contradictions, massive, heavy, and often unforgiving to inexperienced hands. While its resilience inspired confidence, its sheer size demanded skill and endurance to master. Its climb rate and turning performance remained inferior to some German fighters, forcing pilots to rely on dive speed and firepower rather than agility. These challenges underscored the truth that even the Jug, for all its battlefield success, was not invincible. From the high point of its triumphs in late 1944, we must now turn to these limitations, to the weaknesses that dogged the Thunderbolt, and to the struggles its pilots faced in bending this immense machine to their will in the unforgiving skies of Europe. For all its strengths, the Thunderbolt was never without flaws. Its sheer size, nearly 8 tons when fully loaded, made it less nimble than its German counterparts in certain situations. Luftwaffe pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the Focke-Wulf FW 190 could often outturn a P-47 in a tight, low-speed engagement. American pilots quickly learned that dogfighting in the traditional sense was a mistake. Instead, they were trained to exploit the aircraft's strengths: diving speed, heavy firepower, and the ability to absorb punishment that would have destroyed almost any other fighter. Success in the Jug required discipline and tactics that turned its mass into an advantage rather than a hindrance. Range was another early weakness. In 1943, P-47 suffered from limited endurance, unable to escort heavy bombers deep into Germany. Missions often ended with Thunderbolts turning back, while the bombers pressed on into the most dangerous parts of the Reich, left vulnerable to Luftwaffe attacks. The solution came gradually, first through the widespread use of external drop tanks, and later with airframe modifications that increased internal fuel capacity. By late 1944, the Thunderbolt's operational range had been greatly extended, but its early handicap had already shaped its reputation and opened the door for the P-51 Mustang to claim dominance in long-range. Escort, the Jug's size, also carried another danger. It presented a bigger target. Flak batteries across occupied Europe knew well that, while the P-47 was hard to bring down, its bulk was difficult to miss. Crews often described the haunting black bursts of 80-meter shells that filled the sky during ground attack missions. Though the Thunderbolt could take incredible damage, anti-aircraft fire remained a constant and deadly threat. Many never returned from strafing runs against German convoys or armored columns, where even small-caliber flak could shred wings and fuel tanks at low altitude. Adaptation was the answer. Engineers and pilots together shaped the P-47 into a more versatile machine. The P-47D-25 introduced a revolutionary bubble canopy, giving pilots unobstructed visibility that matched or surpassed enemy designs. Later variants integrated rocket racks beneath the wings, transforming the Thunderbolt into a formidable ground attack platform that could deliver bombs, machine gun fire, and high-explosive rockets in a single sortie. With each improvement, the Jug grew deadlier, expanding its role from bomber escort to a weapon capable of shaping the battlefield itself. Training also evolved. American instructors emphasized energy fighting, where pilots maintained altitude and speed rather than engaging in turn-based dogfights. In this style of combat, the Thunderbolt thrived. A diving attack at more than 500 miles per hour, followed by a burst of 850 caliber guns, could tear an opponent apart in seconds. If pressed, the Jug could climb or dive away, using its radial engine and rugged frame to escape encounters that might have doomed lighter aircraft. By the final months of the war, the P-47 had become a mature weapon system. Its weaknesses had been addressed with new tactics, upgraded models, and the steady influx of American industry's resources. Pilots had learned to respect its limitations, but also to trust in its resilience. A trust forged in missions that often brought them home with wings shredded, cockpits leaking oil, or fuselages torn open by enemy fire. The flaws that once threatened its effectiveness became part of the narrative that defined its legend. A machine imperfect in design, but nearly indestructible in spirit. As Germany collapsed in 1945, the Jug's legacy was already clear. It was measured not only in the tens of thousands of enemy vehicles, aircraft and supply trains destroyed, but also in the shaken confidence of those who had faced it and survived. The Thunderbolt had entered the war as a heavy, ungainly fighter with uncertain prospects. It ended it as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that strength and survival could sometimes matter more than grace or speed. From these final combat months, we turn to the closing chapter, the legacy of the P-47 and the place it holds in the memory of the Second World War. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stood not just as another Allied aircraft, but as one of the icons of the air war in Europe. Over the course of the conflict, Thunderbolt pilots destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, and untold thousands of locomotives, armored vehicles, and supply convoys on the ground. These statistics only tell part of the story. What truly cemented the Jug's reputation was its ability to survive and to bring its pilots home against all odds. Countless veterans recalled limping back to base in airframes riddled with holes, engines coughing and controls half shot away. Yet the Thunderbolt held together time and time again. Pilots trusted it with their lives, and that trust was rarely misplaced. On the other side of the war, German fighter veterans openly admitted their frustration. Many Luftwaffe aces confessed that the P-47 was among the hardest opponents to bring down, if not the hardest. Some even nicknamed it the flying tank, a grudging acknowledgement of the punishment it could absorb and still fight on. Post-war studies validated these battlefield impressions. Evaluations by Allied and foreign air forces consistently highlighted the Jug's ruggedness, firepower, and versatility. Unlike the sleek P-51 Mustang, which was celebrated for its elegance and range, the Thunderbolt represented a different design philosophy, one built around survivability, heavy armament, and brute strength. That philosophy worked. After 1945, the aircraft continued to serve in the air forces of France, Brazil, Mexico, and others, proving that its usefulness extended beyond the skies of Europe. For the United States, the Thunderbolt became more than a fighter. It became a symbol of the industrial and strategic might that had overwhelmed the Axis. It represented an America that could build machines in unmatched numbers, train pilots by the thousands, and field an air force that could dominate the skies through attrition and resilience. Where German fighters grew faster and lighter, in desperate attempts to keep pace, the Jug stayed true to its roots, strong, stable, and unforgiving to its enemies. In memoirs, training manuals, and histories written after the war, the Thunderbolt's legend endured. It was remembered as the plane that could not be shot down, the fighter that shrugged off cannon shells and flak bursts, and the warhorse that stood beside its pilots in their most desperate hours. Even as newer jet aircraft rendered piston-driven fighters obsolete, the P-47 retained a unique place in memory. It was not the fastest nor the most graceful, but it was the fighter that embodied resilience. And so, as we look back on those final, desperate battles over Europe, over the smoking rail yards, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and the shattered roads of retreating armies, the image of the P-47 Thunderbolt remains. It is the vision of a machine diving through flak, guns blazing, wings scarred, and yet returning again and again. Its story is one of defiance and endurance, of a fighter that was never supposed to be graceful, but always proved impossible to ignore. The skies of war forged its legend. The men who flew it carried that legend home. And in the end, the Jug became more than an aircraft, it became a testament to survival itself. Suggested. ChatGPT said, on May 4, 1943, the morning haze still clung to the Ruhr Valley as Luftwaffe patrols of Jagdgeschwader 26 rose from their airfields. The smell of fuel hung thick in the air, mingling with the smoke of factories below that had been battered by weeks of Allied raids. German pilots, already weary from the relentless pace of combat, expected to meet formations of B-17s and their familiar escorts. Instead, as the first contrails split the pale sky, they confronted something different, an enormous fighter with a radial roar unlike anything they had faced. Cannon shells that should have torn it apart merely chipped its skin. Pilots who had once claimed victories in seconds watched in disbelief as the new intruder refused to fall. That aircraft was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, making its combat debut in Europe. Nearly 7 tons of metal and engine, it dwarfed the Messerschmitt Bf-109s that circled to intercept. Its Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine produced more than 2,000 horsepower, allowing the Thunderbolt to dive faster than any German fighter could follow. The Luftwaffe's frontline pilots, many hardened aces, found their usual tactics, closing in tight, striking hard with cannon fire, ineffective. One veteran recalled the frustration of seeing rounds spark across a Thunderbolt's fuselage only for the machine to wheel about and return fire with 8 heavy 50-caliber guns, a withering storm of bullets that no lightly armored fighter could withstand. To the German crews on the ground, the sight was equally unsettling. From the fields near Essen and Dortmund, men looked upward as dogfights raged above, the rumble of the Thunderbolt's radial engine distinct from the higher-pitched scream of Daimler-Benz engines. Witnesses described the aircraft as monstrously large, a predator circling the bombers it protected. Even in its earliest sorties, the Thunderbolt earned grudging respect, its size and resilience shattering assumptions about Allied design. Reports filtered back to German command, warning that a new foe had entered the skies, one that seemed built to withstand punishment far beyond expectation. For Allied bomber crews, the change was immediate. No longer did they feel isolated in their lumbering fortresses. The P-47s could carve through interceptors, scattering formations of Bf-109s and FW-190s with sheer firepower. Survivors of these missions wrote later of the reassurance that came with seeing the big radial fighters overhead, each one capable of standing between them and the relentless German attacks. The psychological effect was as decisive as its gunnery. Where once bomber losses had seemed unsustainable, now crews believed they had a chance, a shield that could fight back as fiercely as the enemy. As the Thunderbolt carved its reputation across the Ruhr, it became more than an aircraft. It was a signal of shifting fortunes. To Luftwaffe aces, it was a rude awakening, proof that their dominance was not unchallenged. To the Allies, it was vindication of a philosophy that favored durability and overwhelming firepower over elegance. The Jug, as its pilots affectionately called it, had arrived not merely as another fighter, but as a thunderclap announcing a new era of the air war. And with each clash, disbelief hardened into grim acknowledgement. This machine was here to stay. From these first shocked encounters over the Ruhr, the legend of the Thunderbolt spread outward, growing with every mission. Its reputation was no longer confined to the pilots who faced it, but to the soldiers on the ground, and the commanders who now had to reckon with a weapon that could not easily be stopped. What began in 1943 would soon transform into full mastery of the skies, as production, deployment, and strategy elevated the P-47 into one of the most decisive fighters of the war.